body cam footage has been released for the murder of Henry Nowak. We didn't think we were going to get this from Hampshire and Isle of Wight Constabulary until the conclusion of the Independent Office for Police Conduct's investigation into the conduct of the attending police officers. But the leak from earlier last week that said that there were 3 policewomen attending the scene and 1 male police officer who responded to Henry's pleas with "I can't breathe" and that "I've been stabbed" with "I don't think you have, mate." Those leaks appear to be true. And this bodycam footage still does not answer many questions the public have. For example, Henry Nowak's face is blurred out as he lay dying. The police actually check his face for stab wounds because he says, he's been stabbed in the face. And you can't see the severity of the injuries. So we can't see whether or not they actually saw if he had the stab wounds. We know that he had 5 stab wounds in total. 1 to his lung, a couple to the back of his legs, 1 on his face, another one elsewhere. But they've blurred the faces of those involved. Despite us knowing everyone that was involved in the scene, the only person who hasn't had his face blurred is Vikram Digwa's brother, who, at the time this was released, had not been charged despite lying to the police, alleging that Nowak had racially attacked his brother. And as you can see here, the male police officer decides to drag Henry Nowak's dying body out from in front of a car along the gravel as Henry is weakly pleading that he can't breathe. And even after he loses consciousness, they decide to stand over him, cuff him. You can see there he's got some sort of blood spatters on his hand. Sorry, this is just atrocious. And the last thing Henry Nowak heard was the police officer, indifferent to his suffering, reading him his rights, placing him under arrest on suspicion of a racially aggravated assault, while his murderer and the family just stand around, knowing that they almost pulled off a successful con job here. They almost fooled the police into believing they were the victims of Henry Nowak's brutal murder. Afterwards, the 999 call got released. Patrick Christis played it on his GB News show, where the family decided to lie to the police, call Henry names as he lay bleeding to death from the stab wounds they inflicted on him, and at no point did the police ask any further questions, interrogate those at the scene who were claiming Henry had perpetrated a racial attack against Digwa, rather than administering first aid to Henry, which should have been the top priority according to ex-police officers, just common sense, or by just applying the slightest bit of scrutiny to his attacker's story, at which point it would have fallen apart, because of course Digwa said, "Oh, he called me racial slurs and tore my turban off," and he was wearing his turban. And also, if they just would have patted Digwa down, they would have found Henry Nowak's phone in his pocket, which had a recording of the altercation leading up to the stabbing, where Henry Nowak said nothing wrong. Just atrocious. And the reason is the police have been taught to trust minority communities. And thanks to the Macpherson report following the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which accused the police of being institutionally racist, thanks to the hate crime operational guidance in 2014 issued by the College of Policing following the Macpherson report, thanks to the 2020 Summer of Love over in America that became an export via BLM and anti-racism to Britain, the police now believe that any ethnic minority is the victim of a crime by dint of them claiming they are a victim of a crime, even something as mild as a microaggression or taking offence at a perceived racial slight. And that becomes the overriding priority of the police. To acquit themselves of the charge of institutional racism, they must take seriously any claim of oppression by an imported minority group, no matter how disproportionately violent those groups tend to be, and in this case, that one of said minority group had murdered a man, and he lay bleeding to death in their custody because he'd been accused of racism.
Police emergency.
Yeah, we just been attacked by someone racially. Yeah, this. Right. He just attacked it, took his start. Sorry? Huh? Sorry, we just got attacked racially by some white person.
Right, okay. Whereabouts are you?
We're on Belmont Road.
Just out in the street, are you?
Sorry?
You're just in the street?
Yeah, literally. I just parked up my car to come home, and he's attacked my brother.
We just got attacked racially. We just got attacked by this beep. So, did they call him a name there? Did they call Henry Nowak a horrible name after the brother had stabbed him multiple times? We got attacked by this white guy. He just came out. Now, the thing is, we now know none of that's true. We now know not only is none of that true, but what the boys then did, the men then did, is they made a call to their mother. And their mother, who was not born here, by the way, arrived at the scene, and there's a picture that we're going to show you in a second, which is of the knife that was used, this ceremonial knife. It was 21 centimetres long. This sword, really. At what point does a knife become a sword? I mean, there you go. That's it. The mother arrived at the scene and took the knife and left the scene with the knife and hid it.
Thanks to a religious exemption that allowed Vikram Digwa to carry around this sword, because he wanted to fulfill his obligation as a Sikh to carry his kirpan, this deranged psycho stabbed Henry Nowak to death, and then his brother, his mother and his father, arrived on scene, assisted him in the cover-up, and they used the magic word of racism to deflect any and all scrutiny of their conduct. And if it weren't for Digwa and his brother discussing the killing in the back of the police car, and this being audible on body cam footage, this is also something that needs to be released, hasn't been released yet. If it weren't for Digwa pocketing Nowak's phone, and Nowak just happening to have been on Snapchat, talking to his friends, recording the incident. If it weren't for the mother incompetently concealing the weapon, Henry Nowak would have died and passed into the national anti-racist mythology as just another evil, prejudiced, bigoted British person who attacked a Sikh and was heroically slain in self-defense by the Sikh. We can't live with these people. We just cannot live with these people. But we also can't live with institutions that put the lives of ourselves, our loved ones, our children at risk. And the symbolism of the arrest has not been lost on anyone. Truly, that the sort of sterile, clawed hands of the arresting officers in gloves, handcuffing the pale, lifeless hands of Henry Nowak as a glimmer of light falls on his dying body. I mean, by sight alone, you should have been able to tell that he was heavily bleeding because of how pale he was, because of how breathless he was. The fact that an ambulance took about an hour to arrive on scene. The fact that, of course, his killers didn't even call an ambulance first, because they just wanted him to die and get away with it. So then there was the trial. And the reason I'm making this video is because I want to hammer home, our justice system is not equipped to deal with this problem. We have not had to deal with the dishonesty of clans for thousands of years. Our justice system only works if the families are willing to turn over wrongdoers in their midst. If we value having a moral society, a high trust society, more than we do the social standing of our immediate family members, our clan, or our broader ethnic group. And that's just not something that's common outside of Europe and the Anglosphere. It is not something that exists in India, no matter the religion, because of the concept of izzat, because of face saving, because it is a moral good in these communities to lie, cheat, steal, and kill, so long as it preserves the social standing of your family, your clan, and your ethnic group. And that applies to Sikhs just as it does to Muslims and Hindus too. The BBC decided to do live updates on the trial. And during the trial, at about 4:10 in the afternoon, there was a verbal altercation in the court after Vikram Digwa was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. That means after 21 years, he might be eligible for parole. So Vikram Digwa might get out of prison. This has been referred to the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who hates the British people, so I would be shocked if he actually acts prudently in this case. But it has been referred as an unduly lenient sentence, and the petition is for a whole life sentence. But after he was sentenced, Digwa's family decided to shout out and call Nowak's family, presumably the jury, the judicial system, the police, racist. They decided to shout out after the irrefutable evidence was put forward, after Digwa was convicted, his mother was convicted of assisting an offender trying to conceal the weapon. After Digwa was sentenced to 21 years in prison, they shouted out racist at Henry Nowak's grieving family. They were told to stop, and they had to be restrained by court security. 14 police officers had to wait in the foyer of the court to separate the families, not because Henry Nowak's family was causing any trouble, but because Vikram Digwa's family, after Digwa was convicted, decided to still keep up the slur, the lie, that Henry Nowak was a racist. By the way, Henry Nowak was a racist? Who gives a shit? He shouldn't have been killed. But the unforgivable sin of our society is not violent crime. It is not being a politician who has imported said violent criminals and caused completely preventable atrocities to be inflicted upon our people. No, the unforgivable sin is having a negative opinion of the communities that have been imported and commit disproportionate amounts of said violent crime. And so, even after one of said minority community members kills your children, they will still try to call you racist and ruin your reputation to save face, to preserve their izzat, to preserve their position of privilege, legally and culturally in this country, because they recognise that their presence in this country is conditional on that privilege. Because if we just start judging them by their behaviour, if we just start holding them to the same standards we hold ourselves to, if we realise that they do not reciprocate our tolerance and our generosity and our moral consideration, then they know they must leave. And they have to. If they had never been brought here in the first place, Henry Nowak would still be alive. And we know this was the case because Vox Populi, I believe it was Will Coleshill, was on scene reporting from the court. The BBC makes no mention that a man wearing a turban as part of Digwa's extended family shouted racist at the judge, and presumably at Nowak's family too. And then the BBC decided to report on this, and they said, as they report on the comments from Judge William Mousley, KC, during the sentencing hearing, they said that before sentencing Digwa, Judge Mousley KC told Digwa his actions had stirred up racial tension in Southampton and across the country, which has made many Sikhs worried about their safety. The state's narrative is that the Sikhs are the real victims of Henry Nowak's murder, because now the broader Sikh community will face prejudice based on the actions of Digwa and his family. No, Sikhs are not the real victims of Henry Nowak's murder. Henry Nowak and his family are. And if Sikhs are held in lower esteem because of this murder, then that is not my concern. Instead, they should never have been here because Henry Nowak would still be alive. That matters more. But the state only cares about playing umpire between indigestible tribal minority groups who commit disproportionate amount of violence against the law-abiding natives like Henry Nowak. They only care about managing your expectations, your reaction to these atrocities. They only care about preventing widespread disorder that might cause the whole multicultural project to come crumbling down. They don't care about stopping the crimes. They don't care about preventing these atrocities. They care about containing your outrage and funneling it back to their agenda. And this narrative has been perpetuated by various Sikh groups. It wasn't just the judge that said the Sikhs are the real victims. The Sikh groups themselves are closing ranks, saving izzat. There was a statement from the Sikh Federation UK, and they said, prosecuting counsel told the jury that, in the prosecution's case, the incident was not about Sikhism or racism, but about the unlawful killing of Henry. It was about Sikhism and racism, actually. He used a Sikh ceremonial dagger. He carried it based on a religious exemption, because the state is more considerate of the religious freedoms of imported tribal minority groups than they are of our children's lives. And it's of course about racism, because they used the hex of racism to shut down the critical thinking capacities of the police officers on scene to try and get away with this heinous murder. So yeah, it is actually about Sikhism and racism, but you don't want it to be about that, because that jeopardizes your position of privilege in our country over the native population. You're living here at their expense. Members of your community have now taken a life of one of theirs, and you don't want to suffer the consequences. You're all well and good taking collective responsibility for Sikhism when it advantages you via redistributed resources from the central government, via enjoying protected characteristic status under law, via having your Gurdwaras benefit from charitable status. But when it comes to detrimental consequences for your collective reputation, oh no, we're all individuals, bro. Don't look back in anger. But then they say, nonetheless, the wider Sikh community has unacceptably faced considerable abuse and hate during the trial, as many do not understand the law, the significance of the kirpan, or the responsibility associated with wearing a kirpan. This is yet again using the bogeyman of racism to preserve their position of privilege. This is the same line of argument that Digwa and his family used to try to escape consequences. In the very statement supposedly condemning Digwa's actions and expressing solidarity with Nowak's family, the Sikh community, as represented by the Sikh Federation UK, still laundered the charge of racism that almost soiled Henry Nowak's memory and caused him to bleed to death in police custody. Just today, Jaz Singh, representing the Sikh Federation, decided to put out a statement, and in it, yet again, they tried to deflect blame away from the Sikh community by saying that Digwa's actions do not represent Sikhs. But then he says it is clear he did not intend to go out to kill Henry Nowak. His intention wasn't to seek confrontation or to have any altercation. How do you know that? How do you know that? Are you in his head? Why was he walking around wearing a sword? Why did he stab a man to death he didn't know, who said basically nothing to him? Why, in previous footage, during an altercation with him and his brother in traffic, did he get out of his car with a sword and intimidate the passengers of another car that he was having a dispute with? How do you know Vikram Digwa wasn't just looking for violence? You don't. What you're doing instead is you're trying to deflect away from Digwa's motivations to save the collective face of the Sikh community. You are more concerned about the reputation, the privileged social and legal standing of Sikhs in Britain at the expense of the British people than you are with expressing solidarity with Henry Nowak's family. Because your statement led first and foremost with, well, Vikram Digwa wasn't spoiling for a fight. He didn't go out and intend to kill Henry Nowak. Just disgraceful. And people are just sick to death of this by now. We're sick of the special pleading. We're sick of the minority grievances at the expense of our family members' lives. We're just not putting up with it anymore. And then the Digwa family put out a press statement just before I started filming. The loss of a young life is a grief that no family should ever have to carry. We are deeply sorry for the pain and suffering the Nowak family has had to endure. Well, you didn't do that yesterday when one of you yelled out racist in the court, did you? This is pretty common, by the way. During the Pakistani rape gang trials, the families of the rapists in 2024 in Rotherham, during the sentencing hearing, yelled out, "I love you, Dad," and attacked the victims outside the court and had to be restrained by court security. Other family members have attacked the victims, blamed them, done TikTok live streams with the perpetrators from prison, breaking the law, and have not been prosecuted. And then in 2013, there was a Rochdale trial where the ringleader of a Rochdale gang decided to launch into a rant during the trial, ripped off his shirt, pulled out his chest hair, accused the government, Theresa May, the BNP, the police, the courts, the judge, of a racist conspiracy against Pakistanis who he said were the supreme race. And then he was smiling as he was sentenced. These people are remorseless. They're just using the magic words that our society has unilaterally disarmed ourselves with to evade accountability. Anyway, they said, "We love Vikram. We will continue to love him. That love does not stand in opposition to the sorrow we feel for the Nowak family. Well, it did when you tried to cover up the crimes. Both are real, and both will remain with us for the rest of our lives. We would give anything to turn back time so the path of both Henry and Vikram never crossed that night." Okay, how do we know he wasn't just going to go and kill someone else? He seemed to be spoiling for a fight. We cannot change what has happened. We just hope that no further pain is caused in his name. We apologise to the Sikh community for our son's actions, which have unfairly brought the community into disrepute. We ask this tragedy is not used by anyone to inflame division or hostility towards any community. We now ask for privacy, as we come to terms with what lies ahead. And again, this is laundered through the Sikh Press Association. Number one, the primary concern of the statement is to deflect blame away from the broader Sikh community and to manage community cohesion. I wonder if anyone behind the scenes from the state was involved in telling the Digwa family to release this press statement. But secondly, do you know of a white advocacy organisation that would publish a statement from a family that conspired to cover up a murder saying, "Oh, we're sorry, now please don't blame all white people"? No. But the Sikh Press Association took this statement from the family who were all implicated and complicit in the murder and published it anyway because their primary concern is about preserving the reputation and privileged legal standing of Sikhs in Britain. And it just so happens that after this was released, new charges have been brought against the brother and the father. They're going to appear at the Southampton Crown Court this afternoon. I know that apparently in the coming days there are going to be demonstrations outside Southampton Crown Court. I just have to say this, don't do anything that will get you arrested. The state is looking for an excuse, as you can tell with all of the community cohesion language and warnings against violent disorder they've been laundering through these statements. But this afternoon, Moga Singh, Vikram Digwa's father, faces 6 counts of possession of an offensive weapon in a private place, and Gurpreet Digwa, Vikram Digwa's brother, faces 6 counts of possession of an offensive weapon in a private place, possession of an offensive weapon in a public place, possession of a prohibited weapon, and 2 counts of possession of a knife, blade, sharp-pointed article in a public place. I think they should also face accessory to murder charges because they conspired to create the false police report. They lied to police on scene and over the phone. Digwa's brother had a conversation with him about the stabbing in the back of the police car and presumably didn't turn him in when being questioned by the police. Didn't admit to it, considering Digwa himself pled not guilty, utterly remorseless. But despite these charges, despite knowing that the Digwa family were on scene and lying about it, the Sikh Press Association and other Sikh groups are more concerned with preserving the Izzat of Sikhs than they are with showing solidarity and contrition for Nowak's family. And then we get to an uncomfortable topic, which is Nowak's family. Nowak's family decided to give a statement outside the court. Henry Nowak's father gave a very moving statement. He blamed the police for this, quite rightly so. However, over his speech with the fingerprints of the government's community cohesion liaisons, he even mentions them during the speech. And I do wonder if it was a condition for him to give the speech to include this messaging. Because we know, from the Manchester Arena bombing, and don't look back in anger, from, in America, the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service, who stage managed the response to racially tinged murders and atrocities, like, for example, the stabbing of Austin Metcalf. I believe that the perpetrator of that is currently up on charges, as I'm recording, and also the killing of a young schoolboy, by a Haitian illegal migrant driving around a neighborhood in Ohio, which went viral during the 2024 presidential election. The family's responses are coached by these stage managers to preserve race relations, maintain community cohesion. The same reason that Axel Rudakabana evaded detection by Prevent or interventions by his school. The same reason the government decided to lock people up in the aftermath of the Southport massacre and conceal Rudakabana's identity. The same reason that Merseyside police considered publishing the family's Christian family background to insist he was a Welsh choir boy. The same reason the police didn't investigate the Pakistani rape gangs and still continue to avoid the topic, because they're still going on today. Throughout Henry Nowak's father's speech, he said Henry was one of the most inclusive individuals you could ever meet. This case is not about Sikhism or racism. This doesn't mean going to the streets, it means just focusing purely on knife crime, which is the preferred narrative the government would like. It's the same narrative that came out of the Southport killings. Yeah, they banned your ability to buy knives on Amazon. They blunted the tips of kitchen knives. Bear in mind, the Boy Scouts didn't go on mass stabbing sprees back when they could carry pocket knives. Weirdly enough, there weren't mass racial stabbings when the Anglo-Saxons carried blades themselves. Instead, We all have to disarm ourselves. Women can't have pepper spray. You can't buy a kitchen knife to use at home, because we've imported hostile tribal minorities who will just butcher your children and lie and get away with it and show no remorse. They'll celebrate it, even. This happened after Valdo Calacane stabbed 3 people in Nottingham. There was a vigil with all of the community leaders and faith leaders lined up behind the grieving parents, and the grieving parents gave speeches. Barnaby Webber, Grayson Malikumar, Ian Coates, all stabbed to death by Valdo Calacane, and at the time it wasn't known whether or not it was a terror attack, or as it turned out to be just another deranged African. He has a whole life order in hospital, by the way. He isn't even in prison. Calacane, of course, wasn't imprisoned and was let go from a mental health hospital because the people keeping him were afraid of being called racist. So, yet again, same reason. Barnaby Weather's mother said, "Don't hold any hate in your heart for one race or religion." At the time, at the vigil, when they had One Nottingham, One Together banners printed up in record time, plastered everywhere. I think the state overplayed their hand there, because it wasn't actually about religion or even race in that instance. Maybe it was, given the victims were white and Calacane was black, but it was mainly that Calacane, like plenty of black men, unfortunately, have violent schizophrenic tendencies. It's 10 times the rate of white men in Britain. Something that the state doesn't want to address. Ever since, Barnaby Weather's mother has come out and blamed Valdo Calacane's family, saying if they never brought him here in the first place, my son would still be alive. So when the state isn't stage managing their responses, they're a lot more authentic about where the blame actually lies. It's not with the prejudice that might result from British people noticing that their children are in completely optional danger by the people that the government has brought into our midst. Instead, the blame lies with the perpetrators and the parents who came to our country and raised a killer. Same with Axel Rudikbana. Same in this case with Vikram Digwa. And the response by the Indian community internationally should ward us off ever having any more Indian immigration again. In fact, those that are here should be sent home. Because just like after the killing of a family on a Florida highway by, yet again, Sikh trucker, who did an illegal U-turn. Happened multiple times, by the way. Just like after that, Indian accounts on X have been mocking Henry Nowak and depicting his killer as some sort of hero for killing a white person. This is, again, Izat farming. This is ethnic chauvinism. This is them saying, you deserve to die because you're white and we are Indian, we are better than you. And this attitude, even if we say it isn't common, there are over 1 billion Indians still living in India, right? We've had about 1 million in the last few years coming over. So it's pretty much every country in the Anglosphere. It's conspicuous, that. But there are still 1 billion Indians in India. Let's say that it's 1 in 1,000 Indians that think this way. That's still far, far too many. And so, it's just not worth the risk. We shouldn't allow them any religious exemptions to carry blades around. We shouldn't allow them to build temples and establish ethnic enclaves on our soil. They just shouldn't be here. And if they weren't, Henry Nowak would still be alive. And if they weren't here, the state wouldn't take it upon themselves to play umpire between these communities and prioritize their hurt feelings over the fatal injuries that Henry Nowak sustained because he happened to be in the wrong place, in the wrong time, with a man who should never have been in our country in the first place. Let's look at the political response. So, Keir Starmer finally published a statement after the sentencing, and if you're being charitable, you would say, oh, well, he was waiting for the sentencing to go ahead so he couldn't prejudice the trial, but apparently Lindsay Hoyle forced his hand to say something, because Lindsay Hoyle, if you remember, in 2024, held the Gaza ceasefire vote under duress while people were protesting outside Parliament, projecting from the river to the sea on the Elizabeth Tower, housing Big Ben, and he kept reiterating, I don't want anyone in this house to come under a threat of violence, because David Amos had already been stabbed, various MPs' constituency offices had already been firebombed in Golders Green. And so I think Starmer said this to yet again try to glue the lid shut on sputtering community tensions between the native population who are mourning the loss of one of their own and the imported tribal minorities who are excusing this. I've already seen Ahmed Yaqub on the timeline today saying that it would be improper to strip the religious protections for the Kirpan just because this one guy used it improperly. See, we always think that Muslims and Sikhs are against each other, right? But that's only when they're living in their own countries, vying for power. But when they can form an ethnic bloc, when, as minorities, they stand to gain from these carve-outs and privilege protections under the Equality Act or various bits of legislation governing the slaughter of animals or the carrying of sacred weapons, then they close ranks. Then suddenly there's solidarity between their communities, despite their thousands of years of ethnic blood feuds. Suddenly there's solidarity between them against us. Suddenly, it becomes a zero-sum game for who has the recognition and protection of the state. And at the moment, it's them, not us. Starmer said, "This is an awful, shocking case. Henry's loved ones have gone through the trauma of a long trial and endured Henry's killer making appalling claims about their son, who was thoughtful, kind, and deeply loved." How could they make up those appalling claims, Keir? What did they exploit? Was it the fear of the phantom far right that you have single-handedly helped perpetuate with your nightly broadcasts following the Southport murders? He says it is right that the IOPC is investigating the police's response to this senseless murder, and we must end the cycle of tragedy by tackling the horror of knife crime. No, we have to deport the perpetrators. Or the likely perpetrators. I think, as Rupert Lowe pointed out, the only way to deliver justice in this case is if we look back in anger, we do not listen to the stage management of the state, slipped into various speeches and official statements, and rotting in jail is too good for Vikram Digwa, therefore we must deport his family members and give Digwa the death penalty. We must bring the death penalty back for Axel Rudakabana, for Wayne Couzens. Every single native British perpetrator of these horrible crimes, rape and murder, should hang too. But Vikram Digwa should hang. The death penalty is the only way that these people get the message. They only understand force, the relative loss of social standing and its impact on their community. They only understand that violent actions will be met with violent consequences. And this is the case internationally, because the longer that we show kindness that is taken for weakness, India as a country will exploit us. But that's not just sufficient, right? Family members should be charged. Digwa should face the death penalty. So should his mother, I think. I don't even think she should be deported. She should face the death penalty as an accomplice to murder. But as Nigel Farage, today, for Reform UK, provided an emergency address. And he said, we must make it so that white lives matter just as much as black lives. And he's correct. He did say there needs to be a cultural change within the police to stop obsessing over DEI and positive discrimination and anti-racism. Again, he's correct. He also said that he wanted to refer Digwa's charges to Lord Homer as unduly lenient and push for a whole life sentence. Again, completely correct. But a couple of things here, and I don't want to make this partisan political. I appreciate the Farage has spoken out. I appreciate Robert Jenrick has spoken out. But a couple of things here. First of all, Nigel Farage campaigned for Brexit because he said he wanted fewer Polish plumbers and more Indian doctors. So he wanted fewer surnames like Nowak and more surnames like Digwa, as Keith Woods pointed out on X today, in our country. He wanted more Sikh families and fewer Polish Christian families. He wanted more Vikram Digwas and fewer Henry Nowaks. And he's got his wish. And I don't see anyone pressing him on this. And the journalism class in our country is so complicit in the anti-racist ideology that killed Henry Nowak that they won't. And of course, Reform doesn't do interviews with people that they consider to their right, so I don't see anyone raising this issue. But it's a contradiction that needs to be resolved, because it undermines the credibility of Farage's otherwise strong statement. He also said in there that George Floyd died under appalling circumstances. He didn't. He consumed his entire stash of fentanyl to try and evade capture, and then he OD'd while screaming, "I can't breathe," while in the car before he was even in the hole that Derek Chauvin placed him in to prevent excited delirium. He just died from a fentanyl overdose, and pulmonary hypertension, I think it was, exacerbated by COVID and heart condition. So we can stop engaging in the anti-racist mythology that caused BLM, that caused Hampshire Police to adopt their anti-racist action plan. Because they say in the introduction, the murder of George Floyd by serving police officers in the USA in 2020 was a pivotal moment for policing in the UK, driving the need for real change. Shouldn't have been. The entire thing was a hoax. But the real change that was enacted was that Hampshire Police were more concerned with the hurt feelings of minorities than the fatal wounds of Henry Nowak, and so arrived on scene prejudiced in favour of Digwa's lying family against Nowak. And they said, while this tragic event happened in another country, policing across the UK has over many years had a strained relationship with some communities. Nationally, the Police Race Action Plan, which is what they derive their subsidiary plan from, was created to address the racial disparities and distrust associated with policing, particularly from those from our black communities. And they make commitments such as zero tolerance of racism and ensuring Hampshire, an Isle of Wight constabulary, is anti-racist in all that it does. Yeah, I think the murder of Henry Nowak was about anti-racism. I agree. Understanding and reducing our disproportionality using a reform or explain approach. Understanding the impact, trauma and history of policing ethnic minority communities. Improving outcomes and support for ethnic minority victims of crime. Increasing our contact with and involving ethnic minority communities in our policing and decisions that concern them. Guarantee they're going to draft in a Sikh community liaison to update this guidance to ensure that the Sikh community don't face the backlash from the behaviour of Digwa's family. Watch it like clockwork. Recruiting, retaining and progressing a representative workforce, so DEI recruitment policies. Mandating and developing a culture that supports and values all of its workforce. So they mandated an anti-racist, think all minorities are victims mindset in their police force. They showed up on scene having internalised that training, and they treated Henry Nowak like a criminal and allowed him to bleed to death, drown in his own blood at the scene without applying the slightest bit of scrutiny on the clan, the cabal that killed him and tried to cover it up. But the reason I mention this is because, yes, Nigel Farage is right. There needs to be an institutional culture change in the police. But it goes back well beyond George Floyd. It goes back to the Macpherson report. It goes back to the killing of Stephen Lawrence. It goes back to Macpherson using the private thoughts of police officers that they confessed to one another having, with no ability to know that, as proof that the Metropolitan Police and policing more broadly was institutionally racist. It goes back even further, to the Race Relations Act. It goes back to the state taking it upon itself to manage good community relations between racial groups, to presume that any disparity in behaviour or outcome between racial groups is a consequence of oppression, and so to interpret those disparities as proof of oppression, white against black, or brown in this case, and to therefore penalise whites and protect, promote black and brown people. That has not been discussed by any mainstream politician, except, regarding the Race Relations Act, Rupert Lowe, when he was still in reform. He said that was the first bit of legislation he'd like to repeal as part of the Great Repeal Bill. I'm not hearing any politician talk about that at the moment. I'm not hearing any politician be brave enough to grasp the nettle saying the Macpherson report was wrong. That actually we don't need to spend our lives trying to expunge this ineradicable guilt, this original sin of racism, causing the police to police the private thoughts of citizens to acquit themselves of that charge. I'm not hearing anyone say we need to throw all this out. The Hate Crime Operational Guidance, the Macpherson Report, the Race Relations Act, the Equality Act. I've heard the Equality Act. I've heard the post-2020 racial sensitivity guidance needs to be thrown out, but I haven't heard all of that. And if you just throw out the 2020 stuff, if you just get rid of the Equality Act, you'll default back to the legislation that got us here in the first place. I actually raised this to Suella Braverman at a conference a few weeks ago, and she said we will repeal the Equality Act and then go back to the Race Relations Act, because that was actually a good standard for protecting racial discrimination in this country. I think we should allow every human being to exercise their freedom of association and trust the British public to be prudent in their prejudices. Not arbitrary, but in this case, if our politicians, if our state were more prejudiced against the behaviours that that are demonstrated from the Indian subcontinent, then Henry Nowak would still be alive. And so, I think the cowardice of our politicians is unforgivable. I think the police still haven't been held accountable. I think we still need to press for more footage. We need the rest of that body cam footage. We need the footage for when the police realised Henry was dead. We need the footage of the interrogation of the Digwa family. We need the footage of Digwa sat in the back of the car admitting to the stabbing and not mentioning one iota about some sort of racist statement that Henry made, which still wouldn't have justified him stabbing him to death. We need to ban the curb ban. We need to, as Restore Britain exclusively has proposed, put India on a legal migration red list. And we need to start sending people home. Because there is no other way to keep our families safe. What we need to ensure most of all is, despite what the state says, we need to look back in anger. And we need to make sure that Henry Nowak didn't die in vain.